The United States, founded on liberty and equality, bears deep scars of racism. From the era of slavery to the Jim Crow era, the denial of basic rights has cast a long shadow.
The abolition of slavery in 1865 marked a turning point, but racism remained ingrained in society.
Jim Crow laws legalized segregation and discrimination, denying Black Americans equal rights.
The civil rights movement led to significant legal victories.
Despite advancements, the legacy of racism persists. Institutional discrimination continues in various forms.
Racism, a pervasive and insidious force, operates on multiple levels, often in subtle and interconnected ways. Understanding its various forms is crucial to effectively combating its harmful effects. Institutional racism refers to the policies, practices, and procedures of institutions that systematically disadvantage certain racial groups. This can manifest in discriminatory hiring practices, biased lending policies, and racial profiling by law enforcement. Individual racism encompasses prejudiced attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors directed at individuals based solely on their race or ethnicity. This can range from overt acts of bigotry to more subtle forms of discrimination, such as microaggressions. Structural racism refers to the ways in which historical and ongoing racism have become embedded in the very fabric of society, perpetuating racial inequality.
The Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, born out of the deep-seated pain and outrage over the killings of unarmed Black people by law enforcement, has emerged as a powerful force for social change. Founded in 2013, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, BLM has evolved into a global movement demanding an end to police brutality, racial profiling, and systemic racism.
BLM's central message, that Black Lives Matter, is a simple yet profound statement that challenges the dehumanization and marginalization of Black people.
Through protests, rallies, and online activism, BLM has amplified the voices of the unheard and demanded accountability from those in power.
Social media has played a pivotal role in this regard, allowing for rapid dissemination of information, organization of protests, and mobilization of support.
BLM has faced criticism from some quarters, with accusations of being divisive, anti-police, or even promoting violence. However, the movement has consistently maintained that its message is one of peace and equality, emphasizing that Black lives matter just as much as any other lives.
The enduring legacy of racism in the United States is perhaps most evident in the stark economic disparities that persist between racial groups. From income inequality to wealth gaps, Black Americans and other minority groups continue to face systemic barriers that hinder their economic mobility and opportunity.
One of the most glaring examples is the racial wealth gap, which refers to the vast difference in assets and net worth between white households and households of color.
This gap has been exacerbated by disparities in access to education, employment, and credit. The unemployment rate for Black Americans consistently remains higher than that of white Americans, even during periods of economic growth.
The COVID-19 pandemic further exposed and exacerbated these inequalities, disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities.
Addressing these disparities requires a multi-pronged approach that tackles both historical and contemporary forms of discrimination.
The criminal justice system in the United States, designed to uphold justice and ensure public safety, has long been plagued by racial bias and discrimination.
From racial profiling to sentencing disparities, Black Americans and other minority groups are disproportionately targeted, incarcerated, and subjected to harsher treatment at every stage of the system.
Racial profiling, the practice of targeting individuals for suspicion of criminal activity based solely on their race or ethnicity, remains a pervasive problem.
This practice, often employed by law enforcement, perpetuates harmful stereotypes and erodes trust between communities of color and the police.
The tragic deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and countless others have brought national attention to the issue of police brutality and the urgent need for reform.
The war on drugs, launched in the 1980s, has had a devastating impact on Black and brown communities, despite studies showing that drug use rates are similar across racial groups.
Education, often hailed as the great equalizer, has fallen short of its promise for many Black and brown students in the United States. Despite decades of progress since the landmark Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954, racial disparities in educational opportunities and outcomes persist. School segregation, while no longer mandated by law, persists in many parts of the country due to factors such as residential segregation, discriminatory housing policies, and unequal funding mechanisms. As a result, many Black and Latino students attend schools that are underfunded, overcrowded, and lacking in resources compared to schools in predominantly white districts. Access to quality healthcare is essential for a healthy and productive society, yet racial and ethnic minorities in the United States face significant disparities in healthcare access, quality, and outcomes.
These disparities are rooted in historical and ongoing systemic racism, which has created barriers to care and contributed to poorer health outcomes for communities of color.
One of the most significant factors contributing to healthcare disparities is the lack of health insurance coverage among racial and ethnic minorities.
While the Affordable Care Act has made significant strides in expanding coverage, disparities persist, with Black and Latino adults more likely to be uninsured than their white counterparts.
This lack of coverage can lead to delayed or foregone care, resulting in more severe health problems and higher healthcare costs in the long run.
Even when insured, racial and ethnic minorities often face barriers to accessing timely and quality care.
These barriers can include geographic location, language barriers, and a lack of cultural competency among healthcare providers.
Communities of color are more likely to live in medically underserved areas with limited access to healthcare providers, hospitals, and specialized services.
Affirmative action, a set of policies and practices designed to address historical and ongoing discrimination against marginalized groups, has been a subject of intense debate in the United States for decades. Proponents argue that affirmative action is essential for leveling the playing field and creating equal opportunities for historically disadvantaged groups, while opponents contend that it constitutes reverse discrimination and undermines meritocracy. At its core, affirmative action seeks to promote diversity and inclusion in education, employment, and other sectors by considering race, ethnicity, gender, and other factors as part of a holistic evaluation process. This does not mean that unqualified candidates are given preferential treatment. Rather, it acknowledges that qualifications are not always accurately reflected in standardized tests or traditional measures of merit. In higher education, for example, affirmative action policies may consider race or ethnicity as one factor among many in admissions decisions, alongside academic achievements, extracurricular activities, and personal essays. The goal is to create a more diverse student body that reflects the demographics of society and provides a richer learning environment for all students. In employment, affirmative action may involve outreach efforts to recruit qualified candidates from underrepresented groups, or setting goals for hiring and promoting a more diverse workforce. The issue of racial bias in law enforcement has become a focal point of national conversation in recent years, sparked by a series of high-profile killings of unarmed Black people by police officers. These incidents have exposed deep-seated problems within the criminal justice system and ignited calls for meaningful reform to address systemic racism and promote accountability. Reforming law enforcement requires a multifaceted approach that tackles bias at every level, from recruitment and training to policies and practices. One crucial step is to diversify police departments to better reflect the communities they serve. Studies have shown that police officers of color are more likely to understand the challenges faced by minority communities and are less likely to engage in racial profiling or excessive force.
Training programs for law enforcement officers should include implicit bias training, which helps officers recognize and address unconscious biases that can influence their perceptions and actions. Training should also emphasize de-escalation techniques, conflict resolution, and cultural competency to improve interactions with diverse communities and reduce the likelihood of violence.
The teaching of history, particularly the history of slavery and racism, has become a flashpoint in the debate about race and social justice. How do we accurately portray the nation's past, acknowledging both its triumphs and failings? Fostering understanding and empathy among students from diverse backgrounds is crucial.
Proponents argue that an inclusive history curriculum helps students understand contemporary social issues. Learning about marginalized groups develops a nuanced understanding of systemic racism. However, efforts to implement inclusive curricula face pushback, with critics accusing educators of promoting a divisive agenda.
The pursuit of racial justice in the United States is complex, requiring understanding of historical context and systemic barriers. Meaningful progress needs a sustained commitment to dismantling systemic racism.
Addressing racial disparities requires tackling both historical and contemporary discrimination. This includes investing in underserved communities and reforming the criminal justice system. Promoting diversity and inclusion in all sectors is essential for equity.
Achieving these goals requires a shift in attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. This includes confronting implicit bias and amplifying marginalized voices. The pursuit of racial justice is an ongoing journey. It requires a sustained commitment to dismantle systems of oppression and create a just world.